In a now famous letter from the early 1990s, George R. R. Martin laid out his plan for the novel series A Song of Ice and Fire. A lot was different in those days. It was only supposed to be a trilogy, with A Game of Thrones, A Dance with Dragons, and The Winds of Winter being the three books. There was supposed to be a love triangle between Jon, Arya, and Tyrion, and Jaime Lannister was intended to be one of the main villains of the franchise. He's pitched as the Kingslayer in the early books, and in this letter, Martin details a plan for Jaime to murder everyone ahead of him in line of succession, which I don't even know how that would work in terms of the line of succession, before being crowned king in the later novels. This is obviously a grand departure from what we got in the actual books and the show. I don't know about you, but for much of the run of both, Jaime Lannister is one of my favorite characters. His arc is, in my view, one of the best in fiction, and I'm very excited to see where he'll go in the future of the series. Welcome to Winter is Coming, a series where I go in depth on each A Song of Ice and Fire character's last couple novels, get you caught up to date on what they've been up to, and then delve into my thoughts as to where they might be going in the Winds of Winter. So I ask you to join me, and let's delve into the Kingslayer. Also, before I do that, who should I do next? I'm debating between Tyrion, Brienne, or just doing somebody entirely unrelated to Jaime. That'd be fun to hear your suggestions. I'd love to hear your opinion. And while you're down there, leave a like, subscribe to see more of this series. I'd really appreciate it. Jaime Lannister first becomes a viewpoint character in the third book in the series, A Storm of Swords. I've always been of the opinion that if Martin had been doing epithets, I don't know how to pronounce that word, as chapter titles as early as Storm, Jaime's first few chapters would have been titled The Kingslayer or something similar, before he eventually reclaims his name, like in the chapter of the Bath and Brienne. He goes on to reprise his role as a viewpoint in both A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. In both of those books, I view his story as kind of a mirror to Cersei's. He has a similar number of chapters to her, though slightly fewer in each of those. He has several in Feast and just one in Dance. So that one in Dance is one of my favorite in that novel, full stop. Jaime's journey in A Feast for Crows is pretty all-encompassing. It's a fairly long 7-chapter romp, beginning with the immediate aftermath of Tyrion's escape and Tywin's death. It's a really interesting chapter that I really enjoy, as Jaime is standing vigil for hours and hours, days and days, above the corpse of the father he feels guilty for killing. It's a fascinating series of scenes and kind of dreams intercut with reality, as well as interactions with other characters throughout King's Landing. The most of his early chapters end up being kind of counterparts to Cersei's chapters, where we are seeing her perspective, but her perspective is utterly insane, and Jaime's kind of balancing that and beginning to come to terms with the fact that his sister is rapidly unraveling before his eyes and no longer the woman that he had once, loved. He is later dismissed from King's Landing and sent to sort out the Riverlands as he marches through from castle to castle in order to set them to rights and ensure that the War of the Five Kings is fully wrapped up and in the Lannisters' favor. That tends to be a bit of a mirror to Brienne's chapters. I like the fact that it seems to transition from mirroring Cersei to mirroring Brienne as his chapters go on, as she is kind of wandering through the Riverlands on her own for the entirety of Feast. Honestly, Jaime's chapters in Feast are, I don't know if they're underrated, but they're definitely some of my favorites in the novel. He's got a lot of all-timers, notably the one I mentioned earlier, the Vigil for Tywin, also his meeting with Jenna, where he talks to his aunt. His conversation with Lancel is a lot of fun and reinforces some of his new view of Cersei. And I really like his interactions at Riverrun, both with the Blackfish, which apparently was planned very early on in the development of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, being Martin's only written note for Jaime and a certain outline from very early on in that process. And additionally, I think that him kind of breaking the siege without spilling any Tully blood is a great way to both kind of evolve his oath with Cat and evolve him into a person who's both pragmatic like Tywin, but who definitely still has somewhat of a heart and a conscience and somewhat of a shroud of honor, despite the fact that he doesn't really project that initially, despite his horse being named Honor. So it's a very mixed bag for Jaime. That mixed bag does not apply to the quality of his chapters, as his single chapter in Dance is one of my favorites in the entire series. He goes to Raventree Hall to lift the last siege of the War of the Five Kings, other than the one that Stannis is involved in at Storm's End, and he essentially breaks it without bloodshed, luckily, by negotiating somewhat of a tenuous peace between the Blackwoods and the Brackens. We saw this feud flare up in this week's episode of House of the Dragon, not to date this video too much, and it is really cool to see the nature of history expressed here, as both sides express the kind of root of their supposed conflict from their side's perspective. The Brackens think the Blackwoods caused it, and vice versa. It's a fascinating chapter, and Jaime gets a new squire who I quite like. and it's just great to see him being a more diplomatic figure as opposed to the very martial prowess that he focused on prior to losing his hand, that being the main crux of his development. The ending of that sole Jaime chapter in A Dance with Dragons is one of the biggest left turns a single chapter takes in, I'd say, the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire. In the final 2 paragraphs of the chapter, Brienne shows up out of nowhere and tells Jaime that one of the Stark girls is in Sandor Clegane's clutches, and Sandor is going to kill her if he doesn't come alone with Brienne immediately. We, of course, know from Brienne's story that she's being sent by Lady Stoneheart to bring her Jaime and to try to exact some vengeance, as she is wont to do, and it very much seems to be setting up for his journey in the Winds of Winter. Brienne is Jaime's kind of core relationship in this new phase of his life, and he reflects on it a lot throughout Feast and in this single chapter in Dance before she shows up. So to actually be confronted with her once again, seemingly out of nowhere, with her being injured, half of her face being bitten away, it's really just kind of a strange circumstance for him to find himself in, and it very much is going to have him on the back foot heading into the Winds of Winter, and likely heading directly into a chap with Brienne. We now move into the Winds of Winter and my speculation thereof. It is very much worth noting that I would say Jaime is probably the single most variable character when it comes to the Winds of Winter for me. I have a pretty strong grasp on what I think is going to happen with him in Stoneheart, but beyond that, I have no idea which goddamn direction he's going to take in the Winds of Winter. He could go north, he could go south, he could go west, he could go east. There are a number of different elements, and we'll talk about most of those going forward here. But first, let's talk a little bit about Stoneheart. Brienne was able to save herself and Podrick and Hyle Hunt in order to kind of bring Jaime into her clutches, but we don't really know for what. It's important to note that the last thing Stoneheart heard in life, or one of the last things at least, was Roose Bolton killing her son and saying, not the Lannisters send their regards, like in the show, but Jaime Lannister sends his regards. That very much pins the blame for the Red Wedding directly on Jaime in her eyes, and this is a very consequential kind of colliding of these two plot lines that has been built up throughout both of their stories up until this point. I have 2 potential directions that I could see Jaime's interaction with Stoneheart going. The first is a trial by combat. I think this is the less likely angle, as I don't really know who he would fight or who his champion would fight in order to be really climactic, but it is worth noting that the other 2 Lannister siblings, being Tyrion and Cersei, both have very important trials by combat in their story, which I think could be an interesting element of parallel should Jaime be put in the same predicament. Perhaps Brienne could be his champion and fight maybe Lemoncloak or Thoros of Myr or someone. That could be quite interesting, and it could be a way for George to remove the resurrection expert just prior to the part where all of the characters start dying. The more likely outcome with Stoneheart, I think, is both Jaime and Brienne being forced to do something by her. Most notably, I think the 2 of them might be forced to aid the Brotherhood in perpetrating the second Red Wedding, which I have a video on this channel where I collaborate with Fantasy Haven from a million years ago. That has more details on this theory, but I could very much see Catelyn Stark, or the undead Catelyn Stark, using Jaime as an instrument of vengeance rather than outright killing him. That is because I do not think that Catelyn Stark, aka Lady Stoneheart, is going to be the person to kill Jaime Lannister. Jaime Lannister is such a fantastic and fascinating character that I cannot see him getting killed off this early in the story. I'd see Brienne being killed off a lot more likely than Jaime at this stage. I think that Brienne is more likely to survive the story as a whole, but if one of them is going to die by Stoneheart's hand, I think it'll probably be Brienne, and that'll probably be for the sake of Jaime's development. Though I really hope that does not happen, because I greatly love both of those characters. With that said, I do think that there's going to be some massive consequence coming for Jaime by the way of Stoneheart, and I think that's going to be a very interesting interaction to see early on in the Winds of Winter. It's worth noting that we've heard absolutely nothing from Brienne or Jaime since the end of A Dance with Dragons. We actually hear kind of a report on Jaime as of the epilogue of A Dance with Dragons. Actually, it might have been one of Cersei's earlier chapters. I'll check and put that on screen. But we do hear that Jaime vanished into the Riverlands and has been missing for some time after going off with Brienne. So whatever happens with Stoneheart, he'll be out of the picture for at least a little bit. So that'll be interesting to see how it plays out. From there, Jaime could go any number of directions. I've seen people postulate that he could be the person to kill Lady Stoneheart, but I really don't think that makes a lot of sense for him. Sure, he could be giving her peace, but I think that her interacting with Arya is too great of an opportunity for Martin to pass up, and I think if somebody's going to put down the rabid dog that is Old Yeller / Lady Stoneheart, it's going to be Arya Stark, kind of ending her quest of vengeance. From there, though, it's completely unclear where Jaime will go. I am very confident that he will end up meeting up with Cersei at some point in either the Winds of Winter or more likely A Dream of Spring. The two of them constantly refer to themselves as ending their stories together, and I think that Martin will very much follow up on that, or at least have them interact with each other right after death, like Jaime would find Cersei's corpse, or vice versa. I think that would be very interesting for both of them, just to see their reactions. But the tricky element with that is I'm not really sure where Cersei will go. I think that maybe by the end of the story of The Winds of Winter, she'll end up at Casterly Rock, or maybe somewhere else, or Prisoner of Aegon, which we'll get to in a second. But I could see Jaime returning to the Rock, especially if Cersei is kept prisoner there. Jaime Lannister is a Kingsguard, though, and his first duty is to his king. I think that if Jaime is going to go somewhere immediately following Lady Stoneheart interactions, it's going to be south to King's Landing. However, upon arriving there, he might find that Tommen Baratheon is disposed. At that point, I've seen a lot of people speculate, oh, maybe Jaime Lannister is going to come full circle and become Kingmaker for Aegon the Sixth. Well, that is a very interesting idea, and I can see why people would find that appealing. I don't personally buy it myself. If I was John Connington, and I will be in the reboot of Game of Thrones in about 30 years, I do think that I'm not going to let Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, anywhere near Aegon the Sixth Targaryen, just because he, killed his supposed grandfather, and really wouldn't be great for that. That said, if the man who brought down the dynasty, at least in one sense, Robert's dead, were to crown the new heir, it would have this kind of circular sense to it that could aid the kind of commoners of King's Landing in aiding the kind of reconception of the Targaryen dynasty. That said, if that dynasty were to do something to harm Tommen beforehand, I cannot see Jaime having anything positive to do with them. Later on in the story, I do think that Game of Thrones, the show, kind of has the right of it. I see Jaime's story turning northward as well. He's someone who's very concerned with leaving a legacy at this point and trying to do good, and I think that the natural extension of that is to go north and deal with the others, the White Walkers. And that would naturally bring some sort of reckoning with Bran Stark. The first sin he has in the series, other than sleeping with his sister, is pushing Bran out the window, and I think that him interacting with Bran, or whatever's left of Bran after Bloodraven is through with him, is a very fascinating narrative idea. I've also seen a number of individuals pose the idea that the translation of Azor Ahai from Valyrian is a letter off a piece from Goldenhand. This could mean that Jaime is the prince that was promised, the Azor Ahai, the person who's going to bring the dawn and kill all the White Walkers. And while this would be cool, he doesn't really fulfill most of the other tenets of the prophecy, including being born of the line of Aerys II Targaryen, unless a certain fan theory is correct, where him and Jaime are the products of Aerys II, him and Jaime, him and Cersei, but we will see if that is true or not. I don't really think it is. Also, in terms of bigger theories for Jaime, if my first ever Song of Ice and Fire theory is correct and Robb's heir has survived, and that'll be revealed in the Winds of Winter prologue, I could very much see Jaime serving as a Lord Commander of his or her Kingsguard or Queensguard in order to repair the damage he's done to House Stark, and overall just kind of fulfill his oath to Cat by protecting her only living grandchild. I think that'd be really neat and great symbolism and symmetry for his arc, as I outlined in that theory video, what feels like a million years ago now. I think that'd be a great coda to Jaime's story, and yeah, I don't know. I'm biased because I created that theory, but I just think it's a really good idea for Jaime to protect the Starks through and through. I could see him dying in their name as well. Though I do think he's more likely to die for Cersei, but both could be true at the same time. Overall, Jaime Lannister seems to have a bit of an inverse from his sister's arc. She is spiraling downward and downward into her delusions, whereas Jaime is getting a clearer and clearer picture of himself and the world that he lives in. I believe that Jaime will survive the Winds of Winter, likely to perish in A Dream of Spring, and I do think his arc in Winds is going to be largely revolved around doing good as best he can. I could also see him and Bran being charged by Stoneheart with the protection of one or both of her daughters, should she learn of either or both of their survival. Sansa is a lot closer than Arya, so I could see that more likely, but I do think that Jaime is going to mostly serve as a protector going forward in the series, fulfilling his vows as a Kingsguard, as he really hasn't up until this point. What do you think Jaime is going to get up to in Winds? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your opinions and whatever you think of other characters in the Winds of Winter. While you're down there, leave a like, subscribe. Typical YouTube stuff that really helps my channel, costs you nothing, and really makes me feel great. So yeah, overall, I will have more House of the Dragon content coming, and more winter is coming. So look forward to both of those, and I am very excited to continue this series and continue talking about House of the Dragon, as I've really enjoyed the new season so far. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I will see you in the near future. Goodbye!